Now, of course, the history of racial discrimination is said to have contributed to a persistent economic gap between blacks and whites. To take apart that argument even further, we're now joined by Mr. Kwame Wino. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs, writing in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Mr. Wino, thank you so much for your time. The basic idea of Martin Luther King's speech, at least viewed as an economic problem, was to try and get people to realize that we have to move towards a semblance of racial equality that, of course, would also translate into economic equality. 5 decades on, has that goal been achieved?
In the US, certainly a lot of progress has been made. In the continent in which we live, which is in Africa, I think the first 40 years of independence actually created more inequality than anything else. The question of inequality has just come onto the policy table as a serious issue in the last 10 years. And so obviously now people are dealing with it. I mean, if you bring it home to Kenya, and in South Africa in particular, inequality is particularly bad. And most of it is driven by policy and obviously differential access of citizens to public services. So definitely, it's not a problem that's been solved.
But the issue usually is that once you've recognized the fact that there is inequality, what most countries then tend to do is to put in programs that would give a leg up to the discriminated party. In South Africa, you've got the Black Economic Empowerment Program, for example. Have those really worked? Are they an ideal solution to the problem of inequality as far as income inequality is concerned?
No, and especially in the part of black economic empowerment, I think it's part of the disillusionment that one sees both in what I'd call the fringes of the ANC and a few other people who seem to think that this, and correctly, I think the assessment is correct, that it actually just delivered a new class of people, small class of people who now have political power. Many of them had political power and they've enriched themselves substantially. So they're among the richest people in the continent, but this has not necessarily been spread to the rest of the population, which means there's a design problem in that kind of thing. And I think public institutions in general can only do that by providing access to public services, providing education and all that. But if you have, you try to force a small group of people to actually manage companies that they're not capable of managing, you simply create a new class of people who are given privileges like the Black Empowerment Program did. And in Kenya's history, basically it's people who worked early in the private sector, in the public sector, and then took those advantages and now have accumulated them in the private sector.
But doesn't that then lead us to a bit of a conundrum? Because on one hand, if you say that managerial positions or handing over the positions of management to individuals who are qualified, and these, by definition, the individuals who are qualified with those who've perhaps benefited in some way from inequality, are the ones who should essentially be in that position. What then happens to the rest of the population that's been discriminated against for the last 20, 30, 40 years?
That's why it's a different one. The politics of it is completely different from the economics. And I think it's perhaps even more difficult politically than it is economically. So what leaders tend to do is take the easy option, which is basically just say, okay, we're going to get in 50 people, we're going to get 50 women, we're going to get 50 men and all that. The problem with that is those who get to the top tend to have been people with political power to begin with, and they have some voice and all that. So they're not necessarily the people who need the most help. And so the design problem is basically people have to accept we have this history, and I think if it happens peacefully as it happens in South Africa, it tends to come much easier to actually do something that's better. But obviously it was missed because people hurried with the Black Empowerment Program, which I actually think was designed by people who intended to take advantage of it. The best way is actually to ensure that schools, and even if you need to provide income support, that may be more useful than actually thinking that people should manage companies that they're unqualified to do.
Yeah. Indeed, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. A fascinating conversation as always. Thank you very much for that. We're talking to Mr. Kwame Wino, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs, looking at the question of economic equality 50 years after Martin Luther King's speech.